When we observe China from the outside, it's common to see a rigid, stable, and highly controlled system. But behind this image of solidity, power in Beijing operates on delicate internal balances, especially between the political leadership and the military command. In recent weeks, this balance has been profoundly altered. Silent movements within the hierarchy of the Communist Party and the armed forces indicate that something more structural is happening, something that goes beyond a simple change of names at the top. The consolidation of power around Xi Jinping China has entered a new phase, with direct impacts on the regime's internal stability, the functioning of the military, and its strategic calculations on the international stage. Understanding this moment is essential to comprehending how decisions made today in Beijing can influence global security, alliances, and risks in the coming years. In this video, we will organize the facts, explain the institutional background, and show why this episode is attracting so much attention now. If you value serious and straightforward analysis of what's really happening in the world, please like and subscribe to the channel. This greatly strengthens the channel and helps me bring content that doesn't usually appear in traditional media. Also, let us know where you're watching from. Now let's understand this whole situation. To understand why recent events within the Chinese leadership are attracting so much attention abroad, it's necessary to understand how power functions in contemporary China. Unlike political systems based on alternating governments, China operates under a one-party regime, in which the Communist Party not only governs the state, but is indistinguishable from it. In this model, power is not sustained solely by ideology or economic growth, but by a delicate system of institutional loyalties. Since the founding of the People's Republic, control of the armed forces has always been seen as an essential condition for the regime's survival. The army is not merely an instrument of external defense, but the pillar that guarantees internal political continuity. The famous maxim that power is born from the control of arms is not just historical rhetoric in China, but a structural principle. Therefore, any significant change in the relationship between political leadership and military command has profound implications, not only domestically, but internationally. If you've been following along and understand the importance of this historical background for understanding contemporary China, comment on the word context. Over the years, this system became even more centralized. The rise of Xi Jinping marked a clear turning point in this process. Since reaching the pinnacle of power, Xi has worked to concentrate strategic decisions around himself, reducing spaces for autonomy within the party, the state, and the armed forces. One of the main instruments used for this was the so-called anti-corruption campaign. Officially presented as an effort to moralize the system, this campaign also functioned as an effective tool to remove rivals, discipline cadres, and weaken alternative power networks. In highly personalistic regimes, former allies can become risks, not necessarily through open opposition, but simply by accumulating influence, prestige, and their own relationships. Over time, these purges created a climate of caution within the Chinese elite. Officials and officers came to understand that political survival depended less on technical performance and more on political alignment. This pattern profoundly affected both the civil and military bureaucracies, altering how strategic decisions are debated and implemented. Within this context, the Chinese military structure plays a central role. The system was designed to balance political command and military operation, preventing the army from becoming an independent force. The Central Military Commission exists precisely to coordinate this relationship, functioning as a collegial body that oversees the armed forces on behalf of the party. In theory, this model allows strategic decisions to be debated internally, combining political guidelines with professional assessments. Collegial structures are common in modern armed forces because they reduce the risks of unilateral decisions and increase institutional predictability. When these checks and balances begin to weaken, the system loses its capacity for self-correction. Command begins to respond more to political expectations than to technical assessments, which can compromise planning, readiness, and long-term effectiveness. If you consider it important to understand how these institutional mechanisms work before analyzing any military or political crisis, write the word structure in the comments. It is in this context that Zhang Yuxia emerges. His trajectory within the Chinese military apparatus was not marked by public visibility, but by influence accumulated over decades. He occupied strategic positions in the chain of command, participated in key modernization processes, and built deep relationships within the system. His position gave him privileged access to information, internal articulation capacity, and authority over different branches of the armed forces. For the regime, this represented stability, as Zhang symbolized continuity and experience. At the same time, this same stability could be interpreted as a risk in an increasingly centralized political environment. In systems where personal loyalty becomes the dominant criterion, figures with excessive autonomy come to be seen as potential sources of resistance, even when there are no clear signs of direct challenge. The break between the political leadership and Zhang occurred at a particularly sensitive time. The removal did not follow the usual pattern of discrete transitions or planned retirements. On the contrary, it was accompanied by clear signs of rupture within the high command. The way the process unfolded indicated that it was not an administrative adjustment, but a structural change. Close officers were removed, chains of command were reviewed, and the Central Military Commission was drastically reduced in its effective composition. Internally, this was interpreted as an unequivocal message. No level of influence offers protection when there are doubts about political alignment. This episode marked a qualitative difference from previous purges, as it directly targeted the core that traditionally balanced political power and military command. If you perceive how this moment represents an institutional turning point and not just a change of names, comment on the word rupture. The official justifications followed a familiar script. Accusations of corruption were presented as the formal basis for the removal, accompanied by allegations of serious misconduct. In closed systems, this type of narrative serves multiple functions. It legitimizes the decision before the internal public, signals intolerance for deviations, and discourages solidarity among personnel. However, analysts observe that the language used in official statements and military editorials deviated from traditional patterns, suggesting deeper concerns. Instead of focusing solely on administrative irregularities, the texts emphasized political and ideological flaws, an indication that the central problem was not financial, but institutional. This reinforces the interpretation that the removal was linked to a perception of political risk, and not just to individual infractions. From that point on, control measures began to intensify. Adjustments to the chain of command, increased internal surveillance and operational restrictions signaled an environment of distrust. Normal procedures were suspended or centralized, reducing the autonomy of intermediate levels. These actions are not uncommon in times of internal instability, as they aim to prevent unauthorized coordination and ensure a rapid response to any sign of dissent. However, they also have costs. Internal trust decreases, communication becomes more cautious, and decisions are made with a focus on self-preservation. This type of environment tends to negatively affect operational efficiency, especially in complex organizations such as large-scale armed forces. These events cannot be analyzed in isolation from the regional context. Taiwan occupies a central place in Chinese strategic calculations, both politically and militarily. The island represents a matter of historical legitimacy for the Communist Party and a sensitive point in its relationship with the United States and regional allies. Within the Chinese leadership, there are debates about the pace, readiness, and risks associated with any more assertive move. Disagreements over military modernization timelines and assessments of external scenarios can generate significant internal tensions. When these disagreements occur in a context of extreme centralization, they cease to be merely technical debates and begin to be interpreted as political challenges. For an international audience, especially in the United States, understanding this dynamic is crucial. Internal changes in China affect calculations of security, regional stability, and the global balance of power. The extreme concentration of decision-making can accelerate actions in some scenarios, but it also increases the risk of strategic errors. At the same time, the removal of experienced figures can weaken the institutional capacity of the Chinese military system, creating additional uncertainties. These factors make the current moment particularly relevant for analysts, policymakers, and citizens interested in understanding how decisions made in Beijing can reverberate far beyond its borders. None of this automatically points to imminent conflict or collapse, but it does reveal a delicate period of transition. Highly centralized regimes tend to appear solid until internal tensions silently build up. Observing how these changes evolve, who rises to the vacant spaces, and how the system reacts to internal and external pressures will be essential to understanding China's next moves on the international stage. From the moment the removal of key figures from the Chinese military command becomes public, the regime begins to operate on two simultaneous levels: that of concrete political action and that of the official narrative constructed to explain it. In authoritarian systems, this second level is as important as the first. State discourse exists not only to inform, but also to organize perceptions, limit alternative interpretations, and preserve the image of control. Therefore, when Chinese authorities resort to accusations of corruption to justify sensitive dismissals, this follows a well-known historical pattern. Since the consolidation of the Communist Party in power, accusations of this type have functioned as an accepted political language, capable of legitimizing harsh decisions without admitting internal conflicts. Corruption in this context is not merely an administrative crime, but a flexible moral category that allows different behaviors to be framed as serious deviations. However, when this narrative is combined with accusations of strategic leaks, especially involving sensitive information, technical doubts arise that are difficult to ignore. Highly compartmentalized military systems drastically reduce individual access to critical data, making broad claims less convincing to external analysts. Furthermore, the way the statements are written is noteworthy. Instead of limiting themselves to legal or disciplinary language, they frequently resort to political and ideological terms, suggesting that the central problem lies not in the specific act alleged, but in the relationship of trust between the individual and the core of power. The choice of words, the tone, and even what is omitted in these texts provide important clues about the true motivations behind the decisions. Looking beyond the surface of the official narrative, it becomes necessary to analyze what truly concerns the Chinese leadership at this moment. One of the central factors is the formation of internal power networks within the armed forces. In any large organization, professional relationships transform over time into bonds of trust, influence, and personal loyalty. In democratic systems, these networks are partially offset by institutional mechanisms of external control. In highly centralized regimes, they come to be seen as potential threats. Political leadership tends to interpret excessive autonomy as a direct risk, even when there are no explicit signs of insubordination. In this context, the distinction between political loyalty and professional competence becomes crucial. Experienced officers with technical skills and internal prestige may be perceived as less predictable than younger, politically aligned cadres. For centralizing leadership, political predictability often outweighs operational excellence. Internal networks come to be treated as parallel structures, capable of challenging decisions or delaying their execution. This type of perception doesn't depend on concrete evidence of conspiracy, but on a preventative logic, eliminating risks before they materialize. If this reading about how power perceives internal networks and loyalty helps you better understand the dynamics behind these decisions, comment on the word loyalty. Based on these concerns, the practical actions adopted by the regime become clearer. After the removal of key figures, adjustments to the chain of command become inevitable. These adjustments involve not only name replacements, but also redefinitions of authority, information flows, and levels of autonomy. Internal restrictions are imposed more rigorously, including reinforced surveillance of officers and limitations on communication. Procedures that were previously routine are suspended or centralized, creating a more rigid control environment. These measures have a clear, immediate objective: to prevent unauthorized coordination and ensure that orders are executed without question. However, they also reveal something about the level of trust within the system. The broader and more preventive the restrictions, the greater the perception of vulnerability at the top. In complex organizations, trust is a fundamental operational element. When it weakens, decisions tend to be made based on fear of political consequences, and not just on technical assessments. This can lead to delays, excessive caution, and difficulty adapting to unforeseen scenarios. At the same time, the internal climate is changing, with officers prioritizing displays of loyalty over professional debate. This type of environment is common during periods of authoritarian transition, but it carries significant institutional costs. These costs are not limited to the domestic sphere, as the Chinese armed forces play a central role in projecting regional power. It is at this point that the Taiwan issue becomes impossible to ignore. The island occupies a unique position in Chinese strategic planning, both for historical and geographical reasons. For the Communist Party, Taiwan represents an unresolved issue of national legitimacy since the Civil War. For the region, it is a sensitive balancing point involving the interests of the United States, Japan, and other Asian actors. Within the Chinese leadership, debates about military readiness, modernization, and timelines are part of the normal planning process. However, in a context of extreme centralization, technical disagreements can be interpreted as political resistance. Differences in assessment about the appropriate time for more assertive action cease to be merely strategic discussions and take on personal implications. Military decisions in this scenario directly affect internal political calculations, as the success or failure of a strategy can redefine the balance of power at the top. Therefore, disagreements related to Taiwan are especially sensitive. They involve high external risks and potentially decisive internal costs. If you understand why Taiwan functions as a point of convergence between domestic politics and regional geopolitics, write the word Taiwan in the comments. When these observations are broadened to the international arena, the consequences become clearer. Extreme centralization of decisions tends to produce ambiguous effects. On the one hand, it can accelerate processes and reduce ambiguities in the chain of command. On the other hand, it weakens internal corrective mechanisms and reduces the diversity of perspectives necessary for complex decisions. In the military field, this can affect long-term planning, training, and crisis response capacity. Institutional risks increase when strategic decisions depend on an increasingly restricted circle, as errors become more difficult to identify and correct in time. For regional stability, this scenario generates uncertainty. External observers begin to deal with a less transparent system, where internal changes can produce rapid and unexpected effects. At the same time, the replacement of experienced officers with politically aligned personnel can weaken military professionalism in the short term, even if it increases political cohesion. In the international system, these transformations are closely monitored by governments, analysts, and security institutions. China is a central player in the global economy, supply chains, and the strategic balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region. Internal changes affecting its decision-making capacity have implications that extend beyond its borders. This does not mean that conflict is inevitable or that the system is on the verge of collapse, but it indicates a period of delicate adjustment. Highly centralized regimes often appear stable while functioning, but they can become less predictable when facing simultaneous internal and external pressures. What international observers should be monitoring from now on is not just official statements, but signs of how new leadership is formed, how the chain of command stabilizes, and how strategic decisions are implemented in practice. Throughout this video, it became clear that internal changes in major powers are never just domestic matters. They reveal how decisions are made, where the points of tension lie, and what risks are beginning to form beneath the surface. Understanding these movements helps to interpret not only the present, but also the scenarios being prepared behind the scenes. If you've made it this far, it's because you're truly paying attention to what's happening on the global stage. So, subscribe to the channel, leave a like to support this type of analysis, and write in the comments, "I'm paying attention." In the next video, which is already on screen, we'll go even further and explain what is the plan for a US attack on Iran, and why this topic could gain traction sooner than many imagine. I'll see you there.